Thank you everybody for joining the Crested Butte Mountain Heritage Museum, excuse me, for our History at Home series. My name is Nell Burkett. I'm the curator at the museum. Through the History at Home series, we aim to bring a diverse array of voices to dig into history from different perspectives. The museum would like to start the evening by giving a quick land acknowledgement. So I'm going to read that very quickly. The museum recognizes that we are guests here on this land, historically Ute territory. We acknowledge that the mining and ranching community that established itself at the end of the 1800s was at the expense of the Uncompahgre Ute and the Tabawatch Ute, who were forcibly removed from this area due to the Bruneau Treaty and the manipulation that followed. We hope that you will take time to visit our neighbor, the Ute Museum, located in Montrose, Colorado, with exhibits developed in partnership with the Ute Tribes by History Colorado, our state historic society. While we can never do this history justice, we do include information about Paleo Indians of the Gunnison Valley, the Ute people, the Bruneau Treaty, and the Los Pinos Indian Agency in our exhibits. The Crested Butte Mountain Heritage Museum knows that we have a great responsibility in representing many stories from our history, the good and bad, and we continue to listen to those voices when they're ready to share. Hey, Sandy, you're muted. You wanted to?
Okay, now I made it.
All right, that's great. Glad that worked out. Just wrapping up a little bit of an introduction and we'll get going.
Okay.
All right. This program is being recorded and will be available at crestedbuttemuseum.com along with many other programs that you may enjoy. We hope that you will consider becoming a member or making a donation to support this program and all the work we do here at the museum. You can do that by visiting our website at crestedbuttemuseum.com or by calling us at 349-1880. We are excited that at the end of the month, we are going to start Dwayne Bush's History of Crested Butte series that begins January 28th and will also be Thursdays. That's going to be a 12-part series all about more Crested Butte history. Many of you were here, sat through his Gunnison Country history, so this one's going to be a little more focused in this series. Next week, our History at Home is a panel of guests. We have 3 people joining us. We have Susan Anderton, Lucille Lucas, and George Sibley to discuss the development of art and art business since the 1970s and how this local industry has shaped the community of Crested Butte. Tonight, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Sandra Cortner. If you have any questions for Sandy throughout the interview tonight, please pop them into the chat. So Sandra Cortner has been in newspaper and magazines for nearly 50 years. She's an accomplished photographer and writer and founded the Crested Butte Pilot newspaper, running it single-handedly during the 1970s, garnering multiple awards from the Colorado Press Association and the Colorado Press Women's Association. Since 1968, she has worked for 8 different publications in the Gunnison County and continues to write for Crested Butte Magazine. A gallery of her hand-printed black and white photographs of the old-timers dating from the 1960s commands a place of honor at the Crested Butte Mountain Heritage Museum. Almost all of the photographs are featured in her books Crested Butte Through My Lens and its companion Crested Butte Love at First Sight, both of which you can find at the museum store, or you can also find it on Sandy's website, and I'll drop a link to that so you can learn more about her books there. Finally, Sandra is a founding member and former manager of the Paragon Gallery and served as executive director of the Crested Butte Arts Festival for 16 years. So welcome, Sandy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for waiting for me.
Of course we would wait, of course. You've got great stories. So just to kick us off, how did you come to Crested Butte? When did you first come?
Well, I first came the day after my high school graduation on June the 5th, 1964. My stepfather, who was a doctor studying to be a lawyer, he was going to law school, he had found a group of seminars that were being run by Dr. Hubert Winston Smith here in Crested Butte, Colorado. And it sounded to him like it would be something he'd like to do. So we get out the map and we look up Crested Butte on the map. Of course, it's a teeny weeny place. So we drove up, my sisters and my brother and I and my parents drove up the day after my high school graduation, and we came down the road into town, and none of the streets were paved. I mean, you wouldn't recognize it if you only had come here yesterday. None of the streets were paved, and the houses were all dilapidated, boarded up, along with all the windows. And so we went down Elk Avenue. Nobody was around. There were no cars parked there, nothing. It was like a ghost town. And we drove down to the end of Elk Avenue to the Forest Queen Hotel, which today, today's the Forest Queen. At that time, it was called the Academy Arms. And that was where we spent the night. And the next day, we were told where to go and stay for the 3 or 4 weeks we were going to be there, or summer. I guess it was a summer long program from my stepfather. And so that's how I came with my parents. It was all their fault.
So could you tell me a little bit about this conference that your dad was coming from, and who ran it and what it was like?
It was called the Law Science Academy, and it was run by a Dr. Hubert Winston Smith, who I believe was also an attorney. And he lived in Austin. And every summer he would bring up a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of doctors, and they would learn from each other, so to speak. So the lawyers who were maybe doing some personal injury suits would be able to learn from the doctors. Whatever kind of medicine they would need to help try their case. And I can remember I went to a couple of the lectures, and they would bring in skeletons, and show stuff on the skeletons. And it was kind of fun, but it was for my stepfather, while he was doing that, we were out just messing around. So the day after we got there, it snowed. And that was June the 5th. Right about that time, I decided I wasn't really enamored of Crested Butte. I didn't really like it. There wasn't anyone my age. I mean, there were like 250 people living here, and I had just graduated with a class of 500. So it was quite the shock coming from Tucson.
That's an incredible difference. Wow.
Yeah. And I just left my boyfriend. I mean, he had, said, bye, you're going away for the summer. And I'm like, no. So, when you're in high school, how that's so important to your boyfriends. Silly girl. Go ahead.
So, Dr. Hubert Smith, he's kind of one of these surprising figures in our local history that you don't really expect to have had such an influence on our community. But so many people talk about him as their first landlord here. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think he had been coming up here for many years. A lot of Texans came to Crested Butte. But when the miners left town after the mines closed, they were totally broke. They didn't have a paycheck. They had families to support. And so they would sell their houses for a song. And Rudy Sedmak told me that one of the old timers went to Hubert Winston Smith and said, give me $1,000 and you can have my house and everything in it. Oh yeah, and this was like a nice house. And so he bought up about, I think it was like 26 houses. And he would rent them to the doctors and the attorneys, because there was only I think there were 2 hotels in town, and that was it. And the ski area had 1 lodge, I believe. And so these people needed a place to stay. So he rented them these houses at the exorbitant price of $100 a week. And we stayed, the one we rented was called the Bishop House, and it's right across from the company store. It's what Montagna's started their business in, I believe. So you can see it when you go out the alley from the post office. You'll see that on your left. That's where I stayed, in the upstairs loft. My sisters.
So you were coming for the summers, and then when did you return to Crested Butte, either of your own accord, or did your family bring you back? How did you end up calling this
Well,
place home?
I guess I'd been here for about half the summer and got pretty homesick and wanted to go back and see my boyfriend. So my parents bought me a bus ticket home. So I rode the bus all the way to Tucson, which was not all that much fun. And, but I think once I got home, I realized how much it had sort of been growing on me. And then that Christmas, my parents announced that instead of giving Christmas presents, we were going to go to Crested Butte and learn how to ski. And so that really kind of did it for me, I think, when I learned how to ski, although I really wasn't very good and I fell off the T-bar constantly and the J-bar and had to take lessons. That's a whole nother story, but that's in my book.
And then you moved here after college, correct?
Right. So after college, that fall, I had started school, and then we came up for skiing that Christmas. And then in my junior year, I asked my parents if I could transfer to Western State. And they said, oh no, it's a party school. You can't, we won't pay for it. So I said, well, what about University of Colorado in Boulder? And they said, okay, you can do that. So that's what I did. I spent 2 years at the University of Colorado. And then after my last class, when I moved out of wherever I was staying, I packed everything in my little Volkswagen and I just drove straight here. And by then, my parents had bought a store up the ski area. It was called the Village Store. I don't know if anyone still remembers it, but my mom was running that, and so she said, "Oh, good, you're here. You can help me run this." So that's what I did for a while, and among many other jobs. But so yeah, and then after that, I was just here. I mean, here I was, and I've been here ever since.
So who were some of the first people that you met in town? What was the community like, and who were the people living here or moving here?
Well, most of the people living here were retired miners and their wives and children. A lot of these miners had never married, so they didn't have wives and children. And so one of the first people I met was Henrietta Raines. I had seen this little red building on Elk Avenue that I eventually, well, I can't get ahead of myself. And I thought it was so cute. So I stopped in there to see what was happening. And it was the Crested Butte ski area. They called it Crested Butte Limited office. And inside there, this teeny weeny place, there was a guy running a newspaper that was pretty much put out by the company that ran the ski area. And Henrietta was working there. She was the one who wrote the gossip column. And so I said, can I have a job at this newspaper? I have, 2 years of experience. I was editor of my high school paper. And they said, well, you could help Henrietta get her, some of her stuff for her column. And I said, well, I could proofread. And they went, okay, and you can proofread, but we can't pay you, of course. So she was the first person I met. And then she introduced me to Nettie Capuchin. And I eventually, after I knew Nettie, well, I didn't really even know her that well for a summer. I went and asked her if she would room with me at the University of Colorado, which she did for 1 year, 1.5. So, but most of the people here were like the old timers. But Trudy Yakwach says to me, Sandy, those people are as old as you and I are now when you first met them. Do you consider yourself an old timer? No. She's so funny. So
where did that term old timer come from? How did that, that's such a pervasive term now. But like you said, they wouldn't have called themselves old timers. So how did that become the term for that group of folks?
Boy, I guess I'm That's a good question. I think it was maybe because once in a while you would call somebody who's really old an old timer. Um, so I can't really answer that for sure. That's just that I think people called them that. They didn't always call themselves that, but other people did. Maybe it was the newer people that came, but I never called them that. I mean, I don't remember how I started calling them that, or I'm old, remember?
So tell me about getting into the newspaper and just getting started with the newspapers in Crested Butte, because newspapers have a little bit of a notorious history
Oh
here.
yeah, yeah. Um, when I graduated from college, George Sibley had just purchased, along with Art Norris and Don Bachman, they had just purchased the masthead of the Crested Butte Chronicle, and they were running it. And so when I got out of college, I went into their office and I said, "Do you have a job?" Because you were always looking for jobs. I mean, it's always been the three job shuffle in this town. So that was just one of my many jobs, the newspaper. And he said, well, he said, not really. He said, this is really a one man operation, but I'm going to interview Frank Storica. And if you want, because I told him I was a photographer early years. And he said, would you go and take a picture of him to go along with my story? And I said, I would. And at that time I was, had set up a dark room up in my mother's village store in the back room. And so I went and took a picture of him. And wait, I got off the subject. So that was my first experience with working for the Crested Butte Chronicle. And then, no, go ahead, ask the question.
Yeah. So you said Frank Storica, correct?
Yeah, so I took Frank Storica's picture, and George used it with his article, and then uh, he said to me, "Wow, Sandy, you got him with a long cigar," because he always used to have this stub of cigar at the bar. He and Gal Storica, his wife, they ran Fright and Gals, and he was a bartender. She was the cook, chef, whatever, in the back running the cafe. So then George asked me to take another person's picture, an old timer, Emil Lunk. And so it just kind of ballooned from there. And I just started taking pictures of these guys as they were sitting in the bar a lot of times. And I would just go in and say, oh, can I take a picture? Yeah. And then Frank Storica, who owned the bar, said, well, Sandy, why don't you put them up on the wall? And so I did, and they called them the Rogues Gallery, is what they called it. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah. So
great.
I worked for George on and off, and then he sold the paper to somebody else. And then I got married, and we started our own newspaper because the person George sold to was not the most popular guy in the town, I guess. And do you really want me to get into all that?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah. And so people kept saying, oh, someone should start a newspaper. And my husband at the time said, oh, you could do that, Sandy. You know journalism. Sure, easy. And I said, oh, man, it'd be a lot of work. And he said, oh, well, I'll do the bookkeeping and I'll address the newspapers to get mailed out. And I'll do all this other stuff. I'll build you an office. And so that's what we did. We started the Crested Butte Pilot.
Okay.
Yeah.
And at one point, I when I had talked to Miles Arbor years ago, um, he had mentioned that you were writing a paper more for the
Oh,
mountain. I
yeah.
wasn't
He
entirely sure.
liked
I
to
couldn't
say
understand
that.
what. Okay.
Yeah, he loved to think I was just a ski area rag, as he would put it. But no, it was for the town and the ski area. I just tried to cover everything in the area. But there was only one of me. I did hire somebody part time um, for a while, several part time people that came and went. And Marcia Hegeman's
Yeah.
daughter used to address the newspapers for me. Not the daughter you know now. She wasn't born yet, but her first daughter, one of her first from her first marriage, Vicky.
So where was your office?
My office turned out to be the little red building where I first walked in and met Henrietta, where they were running the newspaper out of originally. And we bought that property, and then Bill went ahead and gutted it, and he found old newspapers in the walls. That's what the old timers used to insulate with, were old newspapers. He found all this hair because it was a barber shop for a while, that building, and he found all this hair pushed up and the old newspapers. And so he saved one from 1880, I think it was. I don't know if it was the Denver Post or what it was, but yeah, so we had a newspaper right there in that little red building that, you know, went through several owners before it was moved back to the alley where it is now. And I'm not sure who's in it now. I think they took the back half of the building off, and it went over somewhere else and became another building. Yeah, I would have to walk you around and show you if you're interested.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, now today it is Butte Bagels. Crazy Old Izzy's, and now it's Butte Bagels over there. Yeah. Okay, so the newspaper business, what were some stories that stand out to you that you wrote on and that you featured in your newspaper?
Oh boy, what year? In my newspaper? Boy, that's a toughie. You know, it was oh golly, Nell. I did some interviews, and I think the stories that really stood out was the year that we didn't have any snow. And I ran around, and we were building on over the road pipeline down Kibler Pass from the reservoir. I don't know if you heard about that. And building the town a new pipeline because the underground line had froze. And so everybody said, well, we'll just build one over. There was no snow that year, and that's why it froze. And people were out of work because there was no snow. So that meant there were no tourists. By no snow, I mean, in February, there was like 5 inches base on the mountain. So you can imagine it wasn't all that. And that was before snowmaking. So I covered all the building of that pipeline and how we named different areas of it that people put together. We named them after those people, like Archie's Angle, where the pipeline took a little curve up the hill, and they named them all very alliteratively. Yeah.
Didn't you have one named after you too?
Yeah, I was Sandy Sag. I was the one at the end. Yeah, I helped with my, I had a 4-wheel drive vehicle, so I was able to ferry some materials and some guys up to work. So that was a fun thing to cover. That was fun. And I mean, looking back, maybe it wasn't, but now it is.
Yeah, right. That is a really great story in Sandra's book. Which of the two is it in?
It's in the second book, I believe.
Okay.
But I better check.
Yeah.
I got one right here.
Yeah. So if you want to read the whole story, it's very good. It's really worth your time. It's very fun.
Pictures were fun too. So.
Yeah. So reversing a little bit, back to the old timers.
Yeah.
What was it like taking their pictures? How did they react to you being kind of one of the new kids in town, taking their pictures?
Well, you can imagine I was much younger and much prettier. And I mean, this is sort of hippie days, right? 60s, 70s, early 70s. And so all of us were wearing halter tops and cutoff shorts and looking kind of pretty. And here's these old timers, and they don't have a wife or daughters or anybody, and we're all paying attention to them. It's like, hey, buy you a drink. And so the next thing I know, they'd be buying me drinks, and I'd say, oh, well, gee, can I take your picture? And so I'd sit there and I'd take their picture. They would buy me a drink. And Frank even let me behind the bar, which is a no-no. And any other person, I don't think he would let behind the bar, so I could get the light better, because they're all sitting facing the bar. And a lot of times I couldn't get in front of them to get their face. Um, but it was fun taking them because I was trying to get them in a really relaxed situation. And I think them having a couple beers and me having a glass of wine kind of relaxed them enough. So when I was shooting, they didn't maybe pay that much attention. So I see this chat.
Yeah, we got a question from Greg. Wait a second, did my grandparents buy you a drink?
Yeah. That's Greg Weekly. I just sent him 2 books.
Oh, right.
He is the grandson of Rosalie and Weldon Weekly, who are big, huge contributors to the Crested Butte Museum, without whom the museum wouldn't be where it is right now. And then their sons contributed again to the Art Center, and their son David helped put that together with his contributions and his expertise as a home builder. So he's teasing me. They did not buy me a drink. I don't think they were in the bars.
So there, during this period, there's a lot of photography coming out of this era. There's other photographers, and you've helped us catalog those photos at the museum. Who else was out there taking pictures, and what was kind of the photography scene at the time? What was going on?
Well, there were 2 papers by that time. And of course, then I sold the Pilot, Miles sold the Chronicle, and then the papers would merge. And then there was a Gunnison paper, started a paper up here that I worked for a while. So a lot of those photographers started out as newspaper photographers. But many of them, I shouldn't say many, there weren't that many, there were probably half a dozen of us. There was Natan Bilo, and he really did a lot of ski work. And so he would work for the ski area, and he went out of town and covered racing for Associated Press, I believe he worked for. And then Bobby Brazel, his specialty was architectural photography, and he would shoot, he's still doing that. He would shoot houses for people who are trying to sell them or whatever. And then there was Paul Gallagher, who did newspaper photography, and Gary Sprung, who did it for a while, and then he moved to Denver. Trying to think, I hope I don't leave anyone out. Tom Stillo sort of came up a little bit later, but he also did the Crested Butte ski areas photography almost exclusively. After in the beginning, he didn't. In the beginning, we all floundered together, you know. Nobody, and this is not digital cameras, you know. You have to remember, this is all film, where you had to develop it and then print it. And I was pretty exclusively in black and white, and Bobby, well, everyone else was for a while, and then Bobby and Natan really turned to color. That was their specialty. Slides, and you didn't have to do your own slides. You could send them out and come back with a finished product, whereas black and white film, you had to finish it yourself, and that's a tricky skill. Takes a lot of breathing chemicals.
So to kind of round out this question, you know, you and I have talked a lot about the development of Crested Butte through the 60s and the 70s. Can you talk a little bit about how the community was really shifting during this period of time?
Yeah, when I looked back on it when I was writing my book, I realized that after during the Vietnam War, we had a lot of people come. Carol Case. We had a lot of people come and try to make a life here. I think they were running from something else, and people came. There were so many creative people and smart people. And the next thing you know, somebody said, "Oh, let's have an end of the season celebration." And so we started flossing. And then Miles Radaman that came in with Baumgartner and his other partner, and they got the town hired them as a planning firm, and then they were able to get the Board of Architectural Control started. Um, we had a lot of things that started happening right at the end of the 60s and then came through the 70s and kind of went up from there. The art festival in 71 was started. So it was just, when you look back and you see it all converge, just kind of pretty neat. Smart people.
Could you talk a little bit about your experience with the Arts Festival?
Oh, the arts festival. Yeah. I love doing the arts festival. It was fun. I think it was I started out in the arts festival helping the director at the time, which was, and I think that was in the 70s and 80s, paint the streets. We used white shoe polish and we painted the booths and the booth numbers on the streets so that when the artists came in, they could find out where they were. And then I was working, of course, at the same time for the newspaper. And at that time, I was working for the Crested Butte Mountain Sun. And that was a part of the Gunnison Country Times. It was their Crested Butte paper. But in 1991, I got laid off. And then I saw them advertising for a director for the art festival. And so I went and applied. And then when I found out they said, yeah, $1,000. And I'm thinking, oh, $1,000 a month. And they said, no, for the whole job. The whole summer. That's what you were going to make, was $1,000. So, yeah, so I took the job and kept at it and tried to expand it. And the thing that I liked best about the art festival was when they opened the booths on the Saturday morning of the festival. And because everybody had put all their wares inside the booths the night before. Because, we didn't have any big theft at that time. And they opened up their booths all at the same time, and it would be like Christmas. I'd walk up and down the street and go, oh my God, that's so gorgeous. That's so beautiful. Oh, I wish I could afford it. That was the best part. The worst part was when artists would call me and go, am I on the waiting list still? Haven't you got a space for me? Please, please, please. Yeah, so it ran the gamut.
I think it was you that told me the story about the very first arts festival and the construction that went on there and the organization that happened. Would you share that?
I think I can. It's probably in one of my books. I better explain it there. But there was a guy named Michael Berry who lived in Crested Butte, and I guess somehow he was able to score a bunch of railroad ties, and he brought them back to town. What are we going to do with these railroad ties? Well, let's build a pavilion and have an art festival, right? So I think George Sibley could tell this story better than I can. But so they built this thing out of railroad ties, and you would go in, and it was kind of low, and people, artists would have their work in there showing it. This was, I think, the very first one. And so it was before there was any kind of structure to it. And there'd be artists sitting on blankets with their pottery or their jewelry outside stores and up and down the street and inside this pavilion. And then they decided, whoever was, I guess, George, they all got together. See, that's what I mean, creative people. They brainstormed and they said, let's carve a totem pole. And so they got Joe Rosamond to bring a big old log down, like 30-foot log down from Kebler. He had a timber cut up there, I think it was. And he brought this log down, and then all the woodcutters in town, Barbara Sibley and Denny McNeil and Kazir, and there was one other guy, and they each took a section of the log and started carving it. And then the end of the festival, they raised this thing up. They got bulldozers and ropes and backed everything up, and they got this thing up in the air and into a big old hole of concrete. I mean, it was quite the feat. That was the best part. And then they had some, pretty good music.
Mhm.
Like old Martin Murphy, is that his name? He's famous now, I think. Anyways, he was here. And so that was the first one.
So, how did your photography and writing career develop? What are some of the fun things that you've been able to do since you've been here?
Since I've been here, fun things besides run a newspaper, that's fun, right?
It is.
Oh, well, I was first into photography, and then I got more into the writing. And when I was in high school, I was more into the writing and I didn't do photography. So I've sort of gone back and forth. And in college, I was doing photography and writing. But it just seemed easier, especially in a small town when it's a small newspaper and you have no staff, to take your own pictures and write your own story. And then you can illustrate your own story, which I always prefer doing. And Sandy Fales has been good with the Crested Butte Magazine, letting me do that often, to just do the pictures. Since everything's gone digital, I don't do it as much because I don't have a digital camera really that's up to par with somebody like Natan or Bobby Brazell or anybody who's shooting now that's really good. Because there's some, really good people shooting out there today. So I don't do as much. I mostly just do writing.
How has the business of photography changed in your experience from where it was to what it is now?
The business, you mean like if you can make money?
I guess the money, the aesthetics, the style, who's doing it now and how popular it is, and
Boy,
yeah.
everyone's doing it now. And I forgot to even talk about Chevy, uh, who does such wonderful pictures. I mean, there are really a lot of good people doing photography now. And that's why I say I don't even really get into it. And much of it is landscape and really beautiful things. Really beautiful. I admire landscape and I take a picture, but it doesn't stack up against theirs. I'd rather go for the stories. I still have more stories to tell. I just haven't had the oomph to write them all down. That's all. It takes a lot.
So when did you first decide to write a book?
Well, since I have been writing all these stories for the newspaper and the magazine, and then I had all those old timers, and I ended up having about 100 of them. And Lyle McNeil put them in the senior center. He hung them all up there in the senior center. We covered every wall. It was like they are in the museum, only 4 walls worth is how he did it because it was a small building. And everybody kept saying, God, man, you ought to just write a book. And so for years, I had that in the back of my head, and I would kind of start seeing if I could lay it out and where it would make sense. And then I got to the point, well, does it make sense financially? Can I do it myself or do I have to get someone to publish it? And who's going to publish a book on Crested Butte, right? So, and all the stories I write are from my own point of view, but they're about other people. So that's a toughie, do their relatives come in and look at the story and go, that's not my dad, you got it all wrong. So there's that, you kind of go back and maybe not. Anyway, so I finally just did it. I just did, I would, well, what really got me going was I joined a writers group and they were so helpful when I submitted my stories, which, all ended up in my books. They had such good criticism and such good encouragement. It was wonderful. Yeah.
And so that was just the first book, right? You came much later to do the second book. Is that correct?
Right. It took me a long time to do the second book because the first book wasn't, it flew off the shelves for a few months, but then of course it sort of sits in your garage. And then you go, oh my God, what am I going to do with all these books? But I still had all these stories and I still had some pictures, although I had used all the pictures of the old timers, but it took me a while because Greg and I were back and forth taking care of his mom in Durango in the winters. And so it kind of upped my chain of thought and made it not as nice as, as anyway. So yeah, second book.
All right. So I'm gonna jump back a little bit again, back to the old timers. Out of, when we have people that come into the museum and they're looking at your photographs and they're just enraptured by their faces. Who were the old timers that had an influence on you and that influenced your life or you found really interesting?
Well, I think Lionel McNeil, my across the street neighbor, was one. He was so generous and so kind, and he was so he always let me take his picture. He was one of the hardest pictures I took. But he taught me a lot of stuff about the old timers. He and also Martha Sporsich, and a lot of it you learn by osmosis just from being around them. You learn things like you always do what you say you're going to do. You always keep your word. You don't go traipsing across people's yards, and you don't let your dog do their thing on their yards. So all of those old timers. I mean, Miles Arbor said something really interesting at the Crested Butte reunion. He said they were like our age group, our grandfathers and our grandmothers teaching us things that you kind of learn what, because a grandfather and a grandmother, it's a whole different relationship. But that's sort of how it felt. He had a really good outlook there. Yeah. And I forgot one of the photographers. I saw it on the screen, Carol Case. Carol Case had a photography business up at the ski area, taking pictures of skiers. And I worked for her briefly. And she was a really good person to work with. And she had another photographer working with her. And he said, I don't know, he said something to me. He accused me of stealing, something like that. And I went to her and said, I can't remember how it worked. I can't work with this guy anymore. I'm going to have to quit. And when she found out what he had been harassing me about, I guess she fired him. Yeah. Carol's a good woman. She's a good woman. Yeah. Sorry.
That's okay. So we're kind of coming to our end here. We're running out of time. So I do want to encourage everybody, if you have questions for Sandy, please do pop it in the chat, or if you have stories to share too, feel free to pop that in the chat. But a question that I always have to ask the people that I talk to is, how has Crested Butte in the Gunnison Valley changed since you first came here? And what do you see for the future of Crested Butte?
Well, the change has probably really been so many people. When Miles Radaman was putting together his planning papers for the town of Crested Butte, he said, at some point, people, there's going to be 20,000 people in the valley. And we have to plan for that. And everybody, I think I was on the council then, and everyone just looked at him like, what, are you crazy? 20,000 people? And you know what? We could be getting closing in on that. There's houses and people where there never were. All the places that when I first came here, we thought belonged to who knows whom. We didn't know. They were just out there vacant. So we would go traipse all over them. And I just to look at, when I come up Valley, I live at Jack's Cabin now. When I drive up Valley and see all the traffic and all the houses, it just sort of boggles my mind. And when I get to Crested Butte and see all the people walking around, and sometimes when I go into a shop, they'll call me ma'am. And I go, ma'am, I'm not a ma'am, I live here. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. Yeah, just the changes. As far as what's going to happen in the future, it's a little scary. I know there are people who have left town, old timers, now old timers, a good friend of mine, because they don't feel like it's their town anymore. They feel like it's sort of been taken over. And so they don't feel comfortable here anymore, even though they're like, you know, 5 generations, like Trudy Yocklich, 5 generations of her family, and she doesn't feel comfortable here anymore. So that's sad.
What do you think is important about Crested Butte's history to make sure that we share with future residents and current residents? And, you know, with this shifting community, what is important to remember and to continue on?
I think the thing that I take away, at least from living here for so long, is how important the people are and how important it is to remember those old timers who were so good, honest, forthright, never beat around the bush. If they didn't like you, you knew it. And if they did like you, well, they might let you know. But that's what I always take away from it. It's always about the people. And so how good they are and how good you need to be back to them. And that's what the photography for me was always about, the people. That was always my favorite thing to do. Always. I did a few weddings, and boy, that's hard. Lots of people, but you don't want to do a wedding.
Hard
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
We got a question from, excuse me, from Kathy in Montana. Are
Oh,
you
yeah.
still chopping your own wood?
No, Kathy, I had back surgery and I sold my house. Actually, I sold the wood stove. So I'm not chopping my wood anymore. But my husband and I have had to gather it from our new residence down here at Jack's cabin, standing dead and stuff for the fireplace in here. But we don't chop it. He just saws it into lengths.
Perfect. Perfect. Is there any last things or any last stories that you want to share before we call it a night?
Oh, God, I read some of my books today. I mean, I started reading them going, oh my God, I forgot this one and that, this. Oh,
That's why it's so good to have those books.
well, it is. It's good for me because then it helps me remember things that I might have forgotten. Like I had almost forgotten I'd worked for Susan Anderton doing framing with her when she had her gallery in the company store. And she let me have her ex-husband's darkroom in there in the back. And it was an old meat locker. And so to get out, you had to push this thing. You couldn't, I mean, if I was in there, nobody could get in. I think it was something like that. I had to push the door to get out. So luckily I never passed out in there. But she was really good to hire me, and she would help me, you know, frame my pictures and pick out the mats when I finally ventured into a little bit of color when I wasn't working for the newspaper.
Mhm.
So it's just one other job I had. It was like the jobs that you have in Crested Butte. I had so many that I've sort of forgotten a lot of them, but I remember we always worked on the holidays, always.
Mhm.
And it hasn't changed, I'm sure now. For it's a resort area, and you just work holidays.
Mhm.
Even Susan Anderton used to work. I think we worked till 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve. People would come in and beg her to frame something for them so they'd have it Christmas morning.
Mhm.
Yeah, and she
Wow.
was so sweet. She always did.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sandy, for taking the time this evening to share your stories with us. I really
Well,
appreciate it.
oh, you're welcome. I really enjoyed it. And how do I see the chat questions? I see a couple, but
We've got, okay, so Tempe says, can't wait to see your photos in the museum and the
yeah.
books. Thanks so much. Kathy says, Sandy, it was great to see you, from Kathy and Don.
Oh, I hope they're doing well. Do well, you guys. Everyone wear a mask.
Barbara Mason says, great memories. Thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Chris Ray, thanks so much. And he says, great talk. Greg Weekly, thank you for sharing your experiences, Sandy. Eric Raddick, one of our good friends out in Oakland, California. Thank you both
Yeah.
for this. Trudy says, thank you and great job, Sandy.
Oh, thanks, Trude.
Yeah. And again, everybody, don't forget that you can find Sandra Cortner's books at crestedbuttestories.com. I put that link in the chat. You can also find her books at the museum.
Yes.
We are open 11 to 5 during the week, and on the weekends 11 to 6. Don't forget that we are doing historic walking tours on Saturdays at 2 p.m. and we also offer private walking tours for those that want to keep their bubble a little smaller. And thank you all again. Next week we will have artist Susan Anderton, artist Lucia Lucas, and historian George Sibley. Historian and author George Sibley next week to talk about, again, some more kind of to build upon what Sandy has shared with us today about how the community has developed through the arts since the 60s and the 70s.
Yes,
so,
and you can ask George about the art festival.
I will.
Yes, ask him. And look for my story on Trudy in the Crested Butte Magazine next season.
All right.
That's my current project.
Great. I look forward to reading that. That's going to be great.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for being here. Bye.